Halfland, an ahistorical prehistory. The Battle of the Wagon. In the 167th year of the Common Reckoning, Helgi led what dwarves he could still muster out of Bensby, marching along the south bank of the Silver Stream toward Drowndaisy Ford. In the midst of the army trundled a wagon, drawn by 2 oxen, and in the back of that wagon was Bina, trussed up and bad-tempered, bouncing and bumping on the bare boards as the wagon rocked and rattled on its way. Helgi's progress was slow. He had to live off the land, and his foraging parties were subject to incessant delays and disruption in their task as a result of ambushes sprung by Fat Mags and his halflings. This band of mercenaries had long been in the pay of Ingildrifa, and she had tasked them with watching the road from Bensby to Drowndaisy Ford, and immediately informing her should Helgi march that way. For Ingildrifa had been waiting for Helgi to make a move. She had gathered her forces over the winter and prepared them for immediate action. Thus, when news of Helgi's manoeuvres reached her, she reacted quickly, marching westward from Geitsbin, arriving at Drowndaisy Ford while Helgi was still some miles distant. She met with Fat Mags, who provided her with the latest information regarding Helgi's current whereabouts. Based on this, she made her plans, and disposed her forces accordingly. And so it was that one chilly spring morning, Helgi and his army awoke to find that they were surrounded. To their north was a small hill topped with trees, beyond which flowed the Silver Stream. To their south was a larger hill, also topped with trees which concealed Fat Mags, who was at the head of a mixed force of some 50 unarmoured halflings and dwarves, the halflings armed with slings and bows, and the dwarves with crossbows. To Helgi's east, coming from the direction of Drowndaisy Ford, advanced 80 spear dwarves, mine guards from Silvermere and the Dark Hills, under the command of Skopti. And from Helgi's west advanced Ingildrifa and the 80 spear dwarves of her personal retinue. Helgi hurriedly roused his troops and prepared them for battle. He was in the centre of the army, at the foot of the southern hill, positioned by the Bina-bearing Wagon, along with 100 spear dwarves. To his east, facing Skopti, was a contingent of 50 armoured crossbow dwarves under the command of Hafnir, one of Helgi's most loyal retainers. To the west, facing Ingildrifa, were the Bensby levies, 50 unarmoured dwarves, bearing shields and axes. Hafnir calmly drew up his crossbow dwarves into a line. Purposefully they spanned and levelled their crossbows, and then, on Hafnir's shouted order, a volley of bolts hissed towards Skopti's advancing spear dwarves. But Skopti's spear dwarves did not even break step. On the other side of the wagon, things were more chaotic. The Bensby levies snatched up their weapons and rushed headlong at Ingildrifa's advancing spear dwarves, screaming abusive war cries as they did so. While this spontaneous charge was undoubtedly brave, Helgi considered that it was also rather foolish, as Ingildrifa's spear dwarves not only outnumbered the Bensby levies, but were somewhat better equipped. However, the situation was what it was, and, rather than standing by and watching passively as the levies were spitted on Ingildrifa's spears, Helgi ordered his own spear dwarves to form up and advance to provide support. It was at this point that Fat Mags and his company made their presence known, emerging from the trees atop the hill, showering crossbow bolts and slingshot down on Helgi and his spear dwarves, causing carnage and confusion in their ranks. Meanwhile, Hafnir's crossbow dwarves were shooting volley after volley of bolts into Skopti's shield wall, but doing nothing to slow the spear dwarves' inexorable advance. On they came, step by steady step, closing with the thin line of crossbow dwarves. The crossbow dwarves attempted to stand their ground, but to no avail. The spear dwarves marched onward, with barely a pause as they did their work, leaving many blooded and trampled corpses behind them. Hafnir and those few of his companions who still lived fled. The Bensby levies had now reached Ingildrifa's spear dwarves, throwing themselves against the shield wall with much noise but little effect, while Fat Mag's halflings and dwarves up on the hill continued to rain missiles down on him. Halgi urged the disorganised ranks of his own spear dwarves forward, throwing them into the fray. The fighting was confused and bloody. Ingildrifa's shield wall slew or threw back most of the levies, but each dwarf that fell or fled was replaced by one of Halgi's spear dwarves, and these were a much tougher proposition. As Ingildrifa's troops began to tire, Halgi urged his spear dwarves forward again in one last effort against the centre of Ingildrifa's line, and the line wavered and broke. Halgi's spear dwarves rampaged through the breach, sweeping all before them. Ingildrifa beat an ignominious retreat, running for her life, closely pursued by a baying pack of Halgi's spear dwarves. But Ingildrifa was not alone. A small group of retainers still surrounded her, and now these turned and repulsed the leading group of pursuers. Ingildrifa was saved, for the moment. Once more Halgi's dwarves charged forward, and once more the few spear dwarves protecting Ingildrifa met them with spear points. Ingildrifa's bodyguards fought bravely and, for a while, held back the tide. But they were hopelessly outnumbered, and one by one they fell. As the last of her retainers was cut down, Ingildrifa fled into a nearby thicket, where she concealed herself, cowering in the undergrowth. From the far side of the battlefield, Skopti had witnessed the rout of Ingildrifa's spear dwarves. He urged the spear dwarves under his own command across the battlefield, seeking to come to blows with Halgi as soon as possible, and so create a distraction that might save the life of the Lady of Unners Crag. With Skopti thus distracted, Hafnir and the remnants of his crossbow dwarves took the opportunity to regroup by the wagon containing Bina, from where they launched a few crossbow bolts at Skopti's spear dwarves as they marched past, more for the sake of good form than from any desire for continued participation in the fighting. But if Hafnir had harboured hopes that he might now enjoy a restful interlude from martial activities, these were dashed when Fat Mags and his company appeared on the crest of the hill above him, menacing him with crossbows and slingshot. Hafnir responded by sending two of his burlier dwarves to drag the still-bound Bina from the wagon. He then shouted up at Fat Mags, informing the halfling that, unless he kept his distance and desisted from launching any missiles down the hill, Bina would have his throat cut. Fat Mags knew Bina of old and was fairly fond of him. He had no desire to precipitate the dwarf's demise, and was concerned that, if he did so, he would fall out of favour with Ingildrifa. He therefore ordered his dwarves and halflings to stay their hands. Stalemate resulted. Both parties stood in place and glared at each other. And still Ingildrifa trembled, alone in the undergrowth. On the edge of the thicket an argument was taking place between the surviving Bensby levies, who wanted to advance into the trees, flush Ingildrifa out of her hiding place and slay her, and Helgi's spear dwarves, who, while they agreed with this proposal in principle, contended that in practice it should be postponed until the threat posed by Skopti had been dealt with. Their present duty was to fight by the side of Helgi, their lord, not rummage around in bushes searching for concealed females. The spear dwarves won the debate. Ingildrifa's pursuers withdrew. And not a moment too soon. Helgi's warriors barely had time to regroup around his banner and hastily form a shield wall before Skopti and his spear dwarves crashed into them. This was no fight for the faint-hearted. It was a struggle to the death between grim-faced warriors, well-trained and experienced in the work of killing. Spears thrust, seeking gaps between shields, testing helm and hauberk, a grinding trial of the combatant's endurance. And it was the spear dwarves of Silvermere and the Dark Hills who proved the most resilient. First one of Helgi's spear dwarves fell, and then another and another, opening chinks in Helgi's ranks. And Skopti's warriors forced their way into these gaps, progressively widening them until Helgi's line could no longer hold, and a wedge of armoured warriors burst through it, driving straight at Helgi and the bodyguard around him. Helgi did not follow Ingildrifa's example. He stood shoulder to shoulder with his retainers and fought alongside them, and after they had all fallen, one by one, he fought on, until weight of numbers and multiple spear thrusts overwhelmed him, and he sank, battered and bleeding, lying helpless upon the trampled earth. Skopti's spear dwarves would have slain him then and there, but Skopti stayed them from their purpose. An adversary who had fought so bravely deserved better than to be stuck like a trussed pig. And Helgi's henchmen still held Bina, and Skopti did not know what had happened to Ingildrifa. If she still lived, she might too be a captive. Skopti was commercially minded. After all, he had risen to prominence as a manager of mines, and his judgment was that, if there was any trading of prisoners to be done, Helgi had more value alive than dead. Seeing that their lord had been taken captive, Helgi's remaining spear dwarves fell back from the fight, but they withdrew in good order, and no great distance, still facing their foes, spear points lowered. And now all the fighting had stopped. The battlefield fell silent. Vatmags and Hafnir and Skopti and Helgi's remaining spear dwarves stared one at the other. Bina trembled at the cold knife blade that was being held against his throat. Helgi lay semi-conscious on the ground, surrounded by hostile spear dwarves, and it seemed that no one knew what to do next. But someone knew and grasped the moment. Ingildrifa emerged from the thicket. She was scratched and dishevelled, with twigs in her hair, but she had the bearing of a queen. The surviving spear dwarfs of her personal retinue, which had been shattered and scattered to the four winds, fell in behind her as she walked up to where Skopti stood over Helgi, who was starting to stir. "Well, Helgi," she said, "it appears that your life is in my hands. You tried to kill me, and justice requires that I repay you in kind. But I would rather be merciful. Tell your dogs to release Bina, forswear your crown, and I will allow you an honourable exile." Helgi looked up at her, blood flowing from the corner of his mouth. "And what if I do not choose exile?" he asked. "Then," replied Ingildrifa, "I will kill you, and if your followers harm a hair of Bina's head, I will also kill them. You are in no position to bargain. You have lost. I accept your terms, said Helgi, and he hung his head. Thus ended the Battle of the Wagon.